She tried to get my cabin shut down, calling the cops like she owned the place. But what she didn't know? I own everything, including the land she lives on. For as long as I can remember, I've dreamed of escaping the noise. Not just the literal noise of traffic and construction, but the constant buzz of city life, people in a rush, endless deadlines, packed sidewalks, and neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls. I wanted silence, but not the empty kind. I wanted the silence of nature, wind whispering through the trees, birds greeting the morning, a creek trickling over rocks nearby. That kind of peace doesn't exist in suburbs or city limits. It lives in places untouched, wide open, forgotten by most and loved by few. Years ago, I came across a stretch of land listed online. It wasn't advertised with fancy pictures or sales jargon. It was just a simple listing, 240 acres in a remote valley, mountains on one side, a river running along the edge. The pictures were low-res, but I saw enough. It wasn't just land. It was freedom. I knew I had to have it. Buying that land wasn't easy. It meant sacrifices. I cut unnecessary expenses, worked extra hours, and saved every dollar I could for years. No vacations, no impulse purchases. Just the goal, to own something that couldn't be taken away, something real, something mine. When the day finally came and the deal closed, I stood there in that valley, alone with the trees and sky, and felt something I'd never felt before. Complete. Silence outside and complete peace inside. At first I didn't do much. I visited on weekends, sometimes camping out with a sleeping bag and a campfire. I walked every inch of it, learning its shape and its spirit. I learned where the sun rose and how the shadows moved across the hills. I found spots where deer grazed and places where the wildflowers exploded into color in spring. This wasn't just a property anymore. It was a part of me. Eventually I decided to build. Not a mansion, not some overdone luxury lodge, just a cabin. Something simple, strong, and meaningful. One structure, nestled in the valley with a front porch that faced the sunset and a chimney that would puff smoke in winter. I designed it myself. Nothing flashy, just wood, stone, and sweat. I hired a small local crew, paid fair wages, and brought in materials little by little. There were no paved roads, no utilities, no cell service. Every bit of progress was hard-earned. But I loved it. Every nail, every plank, every long day under the sun or in the mud felt worth it. The cabin was becoming real. Finally. It wasn't until the structure started taking shape that people began to notice. Not many, of course. The land was so remote that only a few properties bordered it, but one of those neighbors, someone I'd never met, started appearing more often near the fence line, watching with binoculars, taking photos, and one day, yelling something from across the clearing. I couldn't make it out. I waved, trying to be polite. No response. Still, I wasn't too concerned. I knew my rights. I knew I wasn't doing anything wrong. If anything, I felt proud. Most people wouldn't have had the patience or grit to make something like this happen in a place like this. They would have gone the easy route. HOA suburb, prefab house, monthly meetings about grass height. That wasn't me, never had been. By the time the foundation was finished and the first walls were up, I started spending more time on site. I'd sleep in a tent next to the build, wake up with the sun, and get to work. I even started keeping a small notebook of wildlife sightings and weather patterns. It was peaceful. There was no better feeling than standing on that unfinished porch at the end of the day, covered in dust, looking out across land that stretched far beyond what the eye could see, and knowing every inch of it was mine. That's what made what happened next so strange. I was working on framing the interior when I heard tires crunching on gravel. Not the local crew. They knew better than to show up unannounced. I stepped outside and saw a silver SUV parked near the access path. Out stepped a woman in her 50s, wearing sunglasses, holding a clipboard, and looking furious before she even said a word. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask any questions. She pointed at the structure behind me and said, "You can't build here. This is HOA regulated land. Where's your permit?" It caught me off guard. but I stayed calm. "This is private land. My land," I said simply. She scoffed and waved her clipboard. "There are rules out here. You'll be hearing from the board, and probably the sheriff too." I smiled politely, even though inside I was annoyed. She had no idea what she was talking about. This wasn't some cookie-cutter neighborhood. This was wilderness. And as far as the law was concerned, this valley, and everything in it, belonged to me, but I didn't argue. I just let her talk, already knowing she'd be back, and next time she wouldn't be alone. It didn't take long after her first visit for things to escalate. I had assumed she might go home, look into the property lines, realize she was wrong, and move on with her life. But people like her don't like being wrong, and they definitely don't like being ignored. She wasn't just nosy, she was entitled. The kind of person who believes everything within view of her window is under her authority, and I was the new problem on her radar. The second time she came, she didn't bring a clipboard. This time she came storming down the access path, with her phone already in her hand, filming as she walked, narrating loudly about illegal structures and unauthorized development. She spoke with that aggressive, self-righteous tone, the one meant to provoke, to put someone on the defensive. I was standing near the stack of lumber, working with a hammer in one hand and gloves on, when I looked up to see her pointing her phone straight at me like it was a weapon. "You are trespassing on regulated HOA property," she barked, without a hint of doubt in her voice. "I'm building on my land," I replied calmly. She didn't even blink. "This entire valley falls under the jurisdiction of the High Ridge Estates HOA. Did you even read the community covenant? No permanent structures without board approval. No wood-burning stoves. No construction before 9 a.m. I've reported you." I held back a laugh. She was serious. Dead serious. She had created this entire illusion of control in her mind and committed to it like gospel. The idea that someone might own more than a half-acre lot seemed unfathomable to her. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't let me finish a sentence. Every time I opened my mouth, she'd raise her voice or wave her phone in my face. It wasn't long before she pulled out her second device and dialed a number. She turned away from me, but her voice carried over the clearing loud and clear. She was calling the sheriff's office. Her tone changed into a dramatic performance of false urgency, filled with exaggerated concern for unauthorized activity and aggressive trespassing. It was surreal. I stood there leaning on a beam, listening to her twist reality like she was reporting a crime on a TV show. I didn't interrupt. Let her talk, I thought. Let her dig the hole. She hung up and turned back to me with a smug expression, like she'd just secured a victory. "They're sending someone. You're in for it now." I nodded. "All right, I'll wait." She seemed almost disappointed by my calmness. She was expecting a fight, maybe even hoping for it. But I wasn't about to give her one. I knew what was coming and I had nothing to worry about. Let the law show up. Let them see who actually owns the valley. The wait wasn't long. About 30 minutes later, a dusty county patrol SUV pulled up slowly near the path. An older deputy stepped out, sunglasses on, hand resting casually on his belt. Karen practically ran to greet him, launching into another version of her complaint before the man even had a chance to close his door. "I've reported him twice already," she started. "He's building a full structure in a restricted area. There's no approval from the HOA board, and he's violating multiple ordinances. Noise, fire safety, you name it." The deputy let her talk, nodding slowly, clearly sizing her up. After she finished, he turned to me. I walked over with a folder in hand, opened it, and handed him the property deed. It listed my name, the lot dimensions, the parcel number, and a full legal description of the land, including the access road, riverbank, and hillside that stretched far beyond her property line. He flipped through the pages, took out a small notepad, and wrote something down. Then he asked me a few routine questions: construction plans, permits from the county, septic and well management. I answered everything clearly. I'd done everything by the book. When he was satisfied, he turned back to her and said, "Ma'am, this property isn't under any HOA jurisdiction. The boundary lines stop more than a mile from here. He's within his rights." The look on her face was priceless. For a moment, it was as if her entire reality had been pulled out from under her feet. She opened her mouth to argue, but the deputy cut her off politely but firmly. "I suggest you check your documents again," he said. "This land isn't part of High Ridge Estates. You can't enforce HOA rules where they don't apply." She went silent, eyes darting between the deputy and me, clearly scrambling for something to hold on to. Finally, she muttered, "But, I thought," and trailed off. The deputy thanked me for cooperating, tipped his hat, and got back in his SUV. I gave Karen a respectful nod, then turned back to my work. She didn't say another word, just stood there for a moment, stunned, before finally walking back to her car and driving off, faster than she should have on a dirt road. The valley was quiet again, but I knew this wouldn't be the last time she tried something. Days passed without a word from her. No more surprise visits, no phone-wielding rants, no sheriff cars cruising up the access road. For a moment, it seemed like the storm had passed. The cabin was taking shape nicely. The roof was finally up. Windows were framed and the fireplace had been set in stone, literally. With the hard parts out of the way, I started focusing on the finishing details that would make the place feel like home. Peace returned, or so it seemed. Then came the letter. It was folded neatly and taped to one of the boundary markers near the gravel path. White envelope, typed label, no return address, just my name. Inside was a printed notice full of legal-sounding language. It referenced community compliance, safety concerns, and non-conforming development within proximity of HOA jurisdiction. At the bottom it was signed by something called the High Ridge Concerned Neighbors Committee. I chuckled. There was no such committee, just her. The entire letter was a last-ditch effort to sound official, some cobbled-together attempt to flex imaginary authority. She had clearly realized the law wasn't on her side, so she switched tactics, hoping bureaucracy would do what the sheriff wouldn't. This time, though, it didn't make me angry. It made me realize just how uncomfortable she must be with the idea of someone living freely, outside her rules. What she didn't know was that I had done more than just buy land. I had done my research. Every parcel that surrounded her development, every hill, every creek bend, every logging trail, was part of my original purchase. I hadn't just bought the lot where the cabin stood, I bought the entire valley. Miles of raw land that she had never stepped foot on, but now wanted to control by proxy. It wasn't just about noise or fire risk or some other excuse she used to justify her behavior. It was about control. Her house might have sat on a hill with a view, but for the first time, that view included something she didn't approve of, and more importantly, something she couldn't control. That was the real issue. She wasn't just threatened by the cabin. She was threatened by the freedom it represented, so I made a decision. I gathered all the documents, land deeds, maps, tax records, zoning approvals, and made certified copies. I printed a full satellite layout of the valley, with color-coded boundaries clearly showing what was mine. Her property looked like a tiny postage stamp floating in a sea of my land. Then, I mailed a polite letter to her address. No threats, no aggression, just clarity. The letter explained, in straightforward language, that her house did not sit within any HOA boundary that had jurisdiction over my land. The land she referred to as protected had been private property since before her development even broke ground. The cabin was permitted, inspected, and fully legal under county law. I informed her that any further attempts to interfere, whether through false reports, harassment, or fake committees, would be documented and dealt with through appropriate legal channels. I included a copy of the sheriff's written confirmation from his visit. I didn't need to bluff or intimidate. The truth was enough. A few days later, I was hauling lumber when I noticed a car slowly creeping down the path again. Same SUV. She stepped out, but this time no phone in hand, no clipboard, no yelling. She walked carefully, looking more uncertain than before. Her tone had changed completely. She started with a light apology, one of those half-hearted ones. People give when they're not really sorry, just embarrassed. She said she hadn't realized how the land boundaries worked, claimed the HOA told her something different, said she just wanted to keep the area safe and beautiful. I nodded along, not saying much. I didn't need to. Then came the part I didn't expect. She asked if I planned to build anything else. Not in a confrontational way, but like someone testing the water, trying to figure out if the nightmare she'd imagined in her head was coming true. I told her the truth. Maybe a shed, maybe a small garden, maybe nothing at all. My only plan was to enjoy my land, legally and peacefully. There was a long pause. She looked around, eyes scanning the valley like she was seeing it for the first time. Maybe, in that moment, it hit her just how small her world really was, how her assumed authority didn't extend beyond her white fence line. She nodded, murmured something about understanding now, and left. That was the last time I saw her up close. She still lived up on that hill, still trimmed her hedges with military precision, still stared out at the valley every evening from her porch. But she never came down again, never taped another letter, never called the cops, and never mentioned the HOA again. Sometimes I wonder what went through her mind after that final visit. Maybe she realized she'd been fighting a battle she was never going to win. Or maybe, just maybe, she learned something about boundaries. Both, legal and personal. Either way, the valley remained mine. The silence that followed her last visit was almost unsettling. After the months of passive-aggressive notes, false accusations, and police involvement, the absence of conflict felt strange. The cabin continued to grow into its final form, and the land around it slowly began to adapt. Paths were cleared. A rainwater catch system was installed. The solar panels came in and were mounted, providing just enough power for basic needs. The cabin had started to feel less like a project and more like a home. Everything seemed still, but there was an unspoken shift in the air. Her presence never vanished entirely. From a distance, her house loomed at the edge of the upper ridge, and occasionally, her silhouette could be seen lingering at the property line, watching, not interfering anymore, but always there, like a reluctant spectator forced to witness something she couldn't control. Then, something curious happened. The county mailed out updated property assessments and zoning boundary notices for landowners. It was routine, part of a larger rural infrastructure update, but it caused more ripples than expected. The documents outlined newly confirmed lot divisions, adjusted access easements, and water resource rights. My parcel, massive and undisturbed, was noted as independent of all residential associations in the area, with no HOA, no shared road maintenance agreements, and no utility dependencies. Several neighbors received the same documents, including her. What followed wasn't loud. It was quiet, subtle changes in behavior. People who had never spoken to me before started waving when they drove past the edge of my land. A few even stopped to chat on the roadside, curious about what I was building. It became clear that word had spread, not just about the cabin, but about the truth. That I didn't just own a piece of land in the valley, I owned the valley itself. The idea unsettled some, fascinated others. She fell into the former category. It was clear that her idea of community had always hinged on control, committees, boundaries, rules. Now she was faced with a neighbor who lived entirely outside that world, and who legally had more control over the surrounding landscape than she ever would. One afternoon, a registered letter arrived, not from her, but from the HOA board she once claimed to represent. It was written in polite, neutral language and acknowledged a jurisdictional clarification regarding my land. They admitted that my property had been mistakenly included in their original digital boundary maps, and they officially acknowledged that my land had never fallen under their governance. It was more than an admission. It was closure. She must have read the same letter. That same day, her house's front yard, once filled with protest signs about valley preservation and community standards, was cleared. Not a single placard remained. The neighborhood Facebook group, which I had quietly observed without joining, went quiet about the cabin situation. Posts about my property were quietly deleted or edited. Her name stopped appearing in connection. To complaints, she retreated. But the most telling shift came a few weeks later when a delivery truck took a wrong turn down my access road. It was a large load of timber, meant for a nearby property under construction. I flagged the driver down and pointed him in the right direction, As he turned his rig around, he mentioned that he'd passed through the upper ridge on the way in. Some lady up there asked if I knew the guy in the valley, he said. Said something about you owning half the county. I laughed and said, just the valley. He grinned. She didn't look too happy about that. It wasn't surprising. In her world, property was power. And the moment it became clear she couldn't exert influence over mine, that power vanished. For someone used to being the final word in every neighborhood dispute, that must have been difficult to accept. But that was the difference between us. I hadn't built the cabin to prove anything. I hadn't bought the land to rule over anyone. I simply wanted peace, privacy, and the satisfaction of shaping something with my own hands. I wasn't looking to make a statement, but in her eyes, everything about my presence was won. The more she faded into the background, the more the valley opened up. Deer returned to the edge of the clearing. Hawks nested in the tall pines near the north ridge. Even the wild turkeys, once scared off by the sound of distant shouting, strutted confidently across the trails again. It wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming the right to live simply, without interference, without needless drama. The kind of living that doesn't come with neighborhood meetings or property line debates. Just the land, the air, and the quiet. By now, the cabin had become more than shelter. It was a reminder of freedom, of resolve, of the power of staying calm while others flailed around, trying to control what was never theirs to begin with. And just like that, the valley belonged to the silence again. The seasons began to shift, as they always do in the valley. Slowly, deliberately. The wind carried cooler air down from the mountains, brushing against the tops of the trees and rustling the grass in wide, graceful waves. Mornings were wrapped in mist, curling around the cabin like a quiet embrace. The land was beginning to settle, not just physically but emotionally. The tension that once pulsed beneath the surface had evaporated. What remained was clarity. The cabin stood solid now, finished from foundation to chimney. Inside, each room reflected careful work. No contractors, no rushed timelines, just patience and a steady hand. The wood grain glowed with natural light, and the hearthstone remained warm long after the fire died down each night. Every detail served a purpose, shaped by simplicity and self-reliance. Outside, the surrounding valley had transformed. Footpaths had worn into natural trails. A small vegetable garden sprouted behind the cabin, not grand but purposeful. Rain barrels stood full beneath the eaves. A small solar battery hummed gently beside the tool shed. The infrastructure was modest but enough. Everything had been designed for endurance, not show. Though the land was vast, it never felt empty. It breathed. In the mornings, birdsong greeted the day. Coyotes howled at dusk, their voices echoing across the valley walls like ancient music. Deer grazed in the open without fear. The land no longer flinched from human presence. It had accepted. The cabin, the movement, the smoke trailing from the chimney. There was harmony. Even the neighbors, once distant or suspicious, now seemed more at ease. Word had spread beyond the HOA and the upper ridge. Stories always grow legs in small towns, and this one was no exception. What began as controversy became curiosity. Curiosity became admiration. An older couple from the lower road began waving each time they passed the valley entrance. A young family stopped one weekend to ask about building off-grid structures. They'd heard about the project, the resistance, the way it had been handled, with calm paperwork and quiet confidence. Respect grows in the places where drama used to dominate. The woman from the ridge never returned. Her presence remained only in memory. The silence from her direction felt like a final surrender, not of a war lost, but of a truth reluctantly accepted. Perhaps she understood, finally, that control is not ownership. Her house still stood at the edge, trimmed and tidy, overlooking the place she once tried to bend to her will. Now it overlooked freedom. Sometimes people change when their illusions collapse. Sometimes they don't. Either way, the outcome didn't matter anymore. Her approval had never been the goal. Her opposition had never been the obstacle. The only real challenge had been time, and having the patience to let it pass. In the stillness, clarity settled in. Owning land wasn't about fences or titles. It wasn't about declarations or status. It was about stewardship, respect, a kind of mutual agreement with the earth itself. To live here meant to listen, to the weather, to the wildlife, to the whisper of pine needles in the wind. The land had been here long before any of the houses on the ridge, and it would be here long after. Life took on a rhythm. Mornings brought tasks, wood to chop, repairs to make, a kettle to boil. Afternoons gave space for projects, for walks through the back acreage, for shaping the trail that led down to the creek. Evenings were still and golden, sometimes accompanied by the crackle of a fire or the hum of a distant owl. There was no need to prove anything anymore, not to the neighbors, not to county officials, not even to oneself. The point had never been to fight or to dominate, but to preserve something fragile in a world that constantly tried to overcomplicate it. One day, a handwritten note appeared in the mailbox near the old fence post. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was familiar. It simply read, "You built something beautiful. I didn't see it at first." Nothing more, no apology, no name, just a single sentence and a change of heart. Whether it came from her or someone else didn't matter. What mattered was what it represented. A shift, a letting go. Peace isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce its arrival with trumpets or gestures. Sometimes it's just the absence of resistance, the stillness after the final breath of a storm, the knowledge that you can walk your land, breathe your air, build your world, and no one can take that from you. The valley no longer felt like just property. It felt like part of a legacy, even if that legacy had no name, no heirs, no documentation in any courthouse. It existed in the quiet, in the untouched soil, in the knowledge that through stubbornness, calm, and truth, something had been preserved, and that was enough. Subscribe to Expose HOA Karen for more unbelievable real-life stories they never want you to hear.